Ed Flanigan's our first panelist. As a CPA MBA director, expense reduction analyst, a global cost reduction firm with best practice capability addressing indirect costs. Ed, do you have any additional thoughts you want to share with the group before we get started?
Yeah, sure, Drew. As you mentioned, we're global. We're now in 40 countries. We've just opened up in 4 more countries this year. And we help our clients with all their non-salary expenses. And we're willing to work on a contingency basis. We find savings 90% of the time, and 2/3 of the time, the savings come from the current supplier.
Okay, great. Bruce Rubin is our next panelist. Bruce is president of BHR Global with specific focus on building international supply chain networks with relationships across the globe. Any additional thoughts here, Bruce?
So thanks. We work with companies to save money by having them partner with their vendors and not treating them with the enemy, and help take a product from the idea stage all the way through sales to major retailers.
Okay, thanks, Bruce. So Scott McMartin is our third panelist. Scott is vice president of On-Time Edge. Scott aligns manufacturing execution strategies, connecting the dots between symptoms and root causes of current manufacturing throughput and profit performance. Scott, any thoughts you want to add there?
Yeah, just since 1994, when I read a phenomenal book called The Goal, I've just been very passionate about helping our clients improve their delivery and profit performance, whether it be in a production or a project environment.
Okay, great. Thanks, Scott. So let's begin with an opening statement. So in the past 15 months, the world's experienced the black swan event, the pandemic. Leaders across the globe are grappling with significant changes impacting every part of their respective businesses. With many unknowns, cost management presents one area of relative control. So today's panel will explore this opportunity. So let's engage. Ed recently shared a 2021 BDO study identifying that 73% of all manufacturers are at break even or struggling, with 40% indicating they have insufficient cash. I know indirect cost is your expertise. You've referenced this concept of tail spend, which I was a little bit unfamiliar with previously. Can you share with the group what that means and why it's so important?
Yes, tail spend refers to the Pareto principle, where 80% of the spend for a company is usually from 20% of their vendors. The other 80% of the vendors are what's called the tail spend, and that's costs that are purchased infrequently, they're overlooked, and these are areas where there's great opportunities to find savings because the client doesn't have the manpower to look at those.
Okay, so a really powerful area of opportunity. And Ed, with the indirect costs, you say that companies often overpay suppliers by 10 to 30%. Seems like a huge number based on your data. Why is that the case?
Yeah, there's a couple reasons for that, Drew. Some of them is they lack the knowledge of the supplier industry. They're looking at these indirect costs only infrequently, maybe once a year. They don't know what's going on in the industry. And the most important thing is they don't have benchmark data to make sure that they're getting the best prices.
Okay, good. And Amy was going to join us for our session. She's focused on the financial area relative to businesses, and she's identified that office expenses, are often not drilled down, and that ensuring that vendors are valid, you would think that just would be a normal thing to do, are not necessarily done with the discipline that they should, and so there's opportunity for fraud. From the group, any additional thoughts in terms of what Ed has shared here in terms of your experience? Agree, disagree? The concept of tail spend. I mean, are you guys all familiar with that? All right. Okay, good. All right. So, Ed, you often reference top 10 procurement misconceptions. What do you see most often?
Yeah, there's a couple things, Drew. One of them is supplier loyalty. So a lot of times, clients that are working with the same supplier for a long time, they feel that the supplier is taking care of them and giving them great prices. And we often find that that's not the case. The other thing we find is that to get a lower price, clients are concerned that they're going to get lower quality and service, which again is something that doesn't really happen. And the other thing is the clients, when they put their RFP out, they don't know what questions they ask. There might be opportunities to get rebates. There's opportunities to get prebates. And if they don't ask the right questions, they don't take up the opportunity to get that. The other thing is national prices. They feel that a vendor that's national is going to give them better prices than a local vendor. And we find that in most cases, this is not the case.
Got it. Okay. So it seems like there's almost a checklist, I think, maybe from your perspective, that you might work with as you kind of walk through with clients where there might be, I don't know, hidden opportunities and all related to these misconceptions.
Yes, yes. And the important thing is when you go out to the market, you got to make sure you take advantage of all the opportunities, make sure you're asking the right questions. And if the supplier doesn't think you know the industry, that's when they take advantage of you.
Got it. Okay. So they're leveraging they're looking out for their best interests, right? I mean, I think that's what I would say. Okay. Any comments from the group relative to what Ed's just shared there? Yes, Brian. Can't hear you.
You got to unmute.
Sorry. Yeah, I just actually had this experience with EOS Corporate putting out preferred vendors for printed material. And there's been one vendor who has done a lot of work with EOS for the last 10 years, 15 years, local, everybody loves him. I couldn't get a straight bid from this gentleman for printed material that was spec'd by corporate. Like every bid he sent out was incorrect. Like the math was wrong. He just couldn't get it straight. So there was a second preferred vendor many states away. I bid with him. And the first guy who screwed up so many times finally said, I'll give you 25% off to make up for it. And the next bid he sent out was still screwed up. The other vendor that I went to gave me a price that was 30% cheaper than this guy's 25% reduction. Okay, both preferred vendors. My suggestion to corporate when I brought him in the loop was, we're pretty cozy with this guy. He thinks he's sitting here sacrosanct as a vendor. Somebody needs to bid his work, because I bet you it hasn't been done in a long time. Because when I first started talking to corporate, it's like, oh yeah, we love Tracy. He's a great guy. We do all his work with us. He's always Johnny on the spot. Big problem with not pushing back and double checking on the comfort level of your vendors.
Right.
And I've got a similar story. We have a client in one of the business parks up in Montgomery County, and they had a big spend in printing, about $500,000. And our first step is we look at what they're spending and see if there's, opportunities for us to assist them. So we said, yeah, you spend a lot of money on printing. Can we help you out? And the guy goes, no, our printer's great. He hasn't raised prices in the last 5 years. Do you guys know what's going on in the printing industry over the last 5 years? So we went out to bid and we found 40% savings.
Yeah.
And guess what? He is no longer their printer.
Yeah. I think
And that happens all the time. If you know the industry, you know the questions to ask, and you have the benchmark data.
My stance. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, and you have the people corporately who have the wherewithal to question what's going on. And it's not just in a growth industry where you're going to do the buying now and has never been trained, has no perception of this, builds a relationship and gets stuff done, not necessarily cheaply, but makes that person feel comfortable.
And Brian, when we get involved, it's not me that's negotiating. I bring in our printing expert, or I bring in my office supply or my telecom or whatever. So we have experts in each of the industries, and that's where we're able to get that, those great savings.
So here's a question to the group. All right, let's put on our operating hats. We're running the businesses. Why is this discussion so important that we're having right here? You're a leader. You have to hit a certain number relative to your operating profit and cash flow. Why is this important?
It's a bleeding problem. My last corporate role, I ran a large catering company. Every senior executive had an Amex card. Oh, we need that tomorrow? I don't care what it costs. Here you go. There was no purchasing process for a $25 million company. We wasted $1 million the year prior to me getting there. Just right to the bottom line. We were doing $100,000 Amex bills every month. And all I had to do is, it was right there, the waste.
From my perspective, when ever working with leadership teams, this is so critical. Number one, it's immediate. It's immediate and short term. And so with just a little bit of rigor and discipline, whether it's with Ed or anybody else, that's kind of focused in this area, there's little risk. Ed's often talked about the fact that you don't necessarily even have to change suppliers, maybe whip them in shape. And then it drops right to the bottom line. So really, really critical. Bruce, let's flip the coin. You've made a career of achieving significant reductions in component costs. If Ed references the top 10 procurement misconceptions, what do you see on the component side leading to higher than necessary costs for manufacturers?
Well, a number of them are the same as what Ed mentioned, and particularly when he mentioned that somebody hasn't raised their prices in 5 years. That right away is a flag that you're being overcharged, and you need to talk to the vendor about that. And and also you need to treat, from my perspective, the vendor as a partner, and not, in many cases, they're treated like the enemy. And one way to, major way to save money is, for you to go to their facilities to see how your product is being made, and then have them come to, your own facility to see how you're using it, and see how partnering you can make it more effective and efficient. A number of years ago, I was approached by somebody who wanted to have a 5% price increase on $2 million worth of product. And I said, we can't afford that. And then I said, what can you do? And he came back, and the vendor came back and said, if you change the way you buy it, we can not only not have the 5% price increase, we could have a 3% price decrease. And and it was rolled vinyl material. And I said, we can't handle a roll as big as you want. And they said, well, there's a piece of equipment that'll work, and it'll cost $2,500, and the vendor will share the cost with you. So it costs $1,250 to save 3% of, basically 8% of $2 million.
Okay.
And as a secondary benefit, we really, because we were able to use the product more effectively in the plant, cut out all the overtime that was related to that product.
Got it. Okay, so very tactical, right? In terms of some of the benefits there. The big idea I think that you're sharing here, Bruce, is that treat the vendor as a partner, not as the enemy.
Correct.
I guess the implication is talk to these guys.
Yes.
Yeah. So
make sure that you're linked at the hip as it relates to the business, and they might have ideas that you just can't see. So partner is one thing. You've talked about supply chain versus supply chain as a value chain. What is that? What is that all about? What does that mean? Explain that for me.
At every step of the process, from the vendor to your facility to your warehouse, and then to your customer, there's dollars to be saved on the process with labor. Potentially labor saving. Processes with all the automation that's available in the world, that where do you stop? You got to keep looking. And part of what I mentioned before is you go to your vendors and see what they're doing, to automate their processes, and how it can potentially work in your facility. And another way of working with the vendors is take your A vendors and have them have a quote unquote summit meeting, and have them understand what they do, and then there may potentially be savings at your end, and or things you can incorporate what they're doing, and again, they may be able to work together and save money for each of them.
Okay, so Bruce, a couple concepts: vendor as partner, not the enemy. That was number one. The second thought was supply chain as value chain. There are pockets of opportunity to kind of capture across that chain.
Right.
And then one thing you haven't necessarily mentioned here that we've talked about historically was moving from transactional to relational. What does that mean?
Well, for me, transactional is you send out a PO, you receive it, you pay the bill. But you really need to have a relationship with your vendors, so that we're working, as a partner. and I keep getting back to that. But I think that if you don't work with vendors and understand how your product is produced at their facility, and also how they understand how the product they're selling you is used by you. Another example is I worked a number of years ago with somebody that made a caster that was sold to a consumer products company, that they were loading ball bearings by hand. And we told them what we were using it for, and they said, we can just put a plastic ring in there, and it'll function exactly the way that is doing, and it'll save us all the labor of doing it and save you cost. So all of a sudden we saved $100 or $1,000 or more a year on the product, and nobody, the consumer of the product would never know the difference.
Right. So that seems like a pretty easy pickup. I mean, what you've
Yes.
identified there. But
Right.
let me poke at you a little bit. So Brian basically said, look, I went back to corporate. We had these folks from a printing perspective. Tracy seems like a great guy. That's relational. Okay.
Right.
They've been working with him or her for however many years. What's the difference, though? Right? I mean, that's an example. I think if I heard correctly, he said, that he was going to be a good partner and give a 25% discount. But when Brian went to somebody else, it was 30% off of that 25%.
Well,
So it was almost 50%. So what do we do here, Ed? What's your experience, in terms of these strong relationships with suppliers? How do you handle that without hurting people's feelings?
Well, the thing is, Drew, you don't want the person negotiating that has the contact with the supplier, the guy that goes to the golf course
Okay.
and gets tickets to the games. That's not the guy you want negotiating, because they're too tight. You need to have somebody without a relationship doing the negotiating. And that's why they call on us as a third party to come in.
Got it. Okay. So by virtue of having a third party come in, who, yes, the relationships are important, but whether it's annually or semi-annually or quarterly, I think what I hear you saying is it's good to have a third party expert that can play the bad guy, if you will, just to make sure that these organizations are held accountable. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yes. And again, we don't have any supplier relationships, so we don't have a dog in the fight. We're looking at the best opportunity, not only savings, but also to get good quality and service.
Okay, great. Scott, I want to turn to you. I know your primary expertise is addressing theory of constraints through advanced scheduling and effective project management. However, one of the things that kind of blew me away is that you link your work to a 50% reduction in inventory and OpEx direct costs beginning within 2 production cycles, for a manufacturer. That just kind of blew me away. Within 2 production cycles, I could have a potential 50% reduction in OpEx and working capital. So that seems like it's pretty aggressive to me. So if Ed's focused on indirect costs and Bruce is focused on component costs, what are the keys that you believe, Scott, might help companies achieve the significant improvements that you're referring to?
Yeah, I mean, essentially what we do is it boils down to understanding capacity and then proactively managing the constrained capacity of the process, right? Every business, whether it's a project related business or a production business, has variability and dependency of the steps that they go through to fulfill the customer's demand. So and I'd say this is probably key, know what your capacity is. If you don't know what it is, you're going to constantly overbook it, and then you're going to be in a situation where you're constantly firefighting and probably overspending. So the key is know the capacity that you have, and then proactively manage a synchronized flow of material or work through that capacity and then out to the customer. Just simply doing that is going to have a dramatic effect on work in process inventory, overall inventory, and all the expediting expenses associated with the overbooking situation that most companies are in.
Okay, so Scott, you and I have talked about this concept, balance capacity versus balance flow.
Mm-hmm.
And they're 2 different headsets, right? But it seems like what we're talking about here in terms of savings, cost of savings, and maybe reduction in working capital is linked to a real clear understanding of the difference between balance capacity and balance flow. Can you just shed a few layman's thoughts as to what we're talking about and why that's important?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, a lot of companies will take a look at the capacity that they have to produce, and they'll know that they have a constraint. But what they'd rather do is, rather than managing that constraint more effectively, they actually would make a capital investment to improve the capacity of the work centers up and downstream. They're not necessarily going to get any benefit in terms of additional throughput, because most companies today are not high volume repetitive companies. They have high mix, low volume. And whenever the mix changes, all of a sudden the bottleneck starts to move. So if you have a balanced capacity environment, as soon as the mix changes, then the bottleneck that you have in one place now moves to another place. If you actually know what the capacity of the constraint is, and you manage the investment in additional capacity based on the trends associated with that use of that resource, you're going to actually spend a lot less on capital, and you're going to get a lot more through the capacity that you have.
Okay,
So it's really about balancing the flow of material through the capacity that you have, not necessarily elevating the capacity to be the same from start to finish.
okay, so you talk about this thing called a constraint. What is that? What's a good example of a constraint?
Well, in the TOC world, they use a term called a bottleneck, which basically says it's a constrained resource that has equal to or less than the demand of the market. If it's not necessarily capacity is below the demand in the market, but it is relatively less than the other resources around it, then it would be more termed a capacity constraint. So there's a little bit of a difference there, but essentially it's just it's a resource, whether it's a person or it's a machine in the shop floor, or it's potentially the market, or possibly even a supply base.
Okay.
When there is a constraint relative to the flow of material, that's what needs to be understood and managed better.
Okay, so you're the teacher. Let me see if I can pair it back to you. I think what I just heard you say. So there is a constraint within the system, and actually it could be a manufacturer or a service provider. Doesn't matter,
Sure.
right? Mm-hmm. So if it's a manufacturer, it might be a work center. And so if the work center has limited capacity relative to what they can do, then it really doesn't make sense to have inventory or bodies at all these other work centers, because if I can only get so much through that one particular center, then I need to optimize against that, which means I could take my people headcount down or my working capital inventory headcount down relative to all the other centers that are out there, because I have to optimize against this constraint, right? So that, that's balanced flow. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, that is an initial instinct, is to think about, laying off people. But the idea here would be to make sure that the constrained resource is actually only processing material or work that's actually sold to a customer at the end of the line. That's why, cost accounting would cause people to sort of batch work together, have minimum batch sizes, which is not necessarily meaning that everything that goes through the work center is actually a sold product. It's just being done for efficiency's sake. Then you end up with a lot of finished good inventory, or possibly even obsolete inventory at some point in time. So the idea is just to make sure that once you understand what the constraint is, that you exploit the constraint as fully as possible. Make sure that we're not working on bad parts. We're not making stuff that hasn't been sold. And so once you've got that figured out and you start to actually ramp up your throughput, now all of a sudden those people that you might have thought about laying off, you actually might need. So the idea is don't overactivate the systems around the constraint.
Okay, great. Any questions or thoughts on what Scott just shared? Any observations, guys?
Sure. Yeah, this is Bob Furlado. So just wanted to comment on a couple of the concepts that were put out there. So collaboration within the, as you referred to it, value chain is so critical. So supply chains and organizations operate within a value chain ecosystem. So down to the supplier's supplier through to the customer's customer. You need to make sure that you integrate, but first collaborate and align with those folks. That's easier said than done, but that's the goal. Right. And then the focus should not necessarily be short-term on your internal costs, but really how do you reduce the overall total cost of the value chain? And by doing that, by taking that approach, by changing and shifting your paradigm, you then can bring in and align with your suppliers and your suppliers, as well as your customers and their customers. So this whole notion of collaboration, as Bruce mentioned, is so critical. Collaboration is important because supply chains operate within these value chains. Yeah, we need to move away from the adversarial approaches with suppliers, right? To truly partner with them. Again, easier said than done. And then again, this focus on total cost in the value chain and reducing that together in partnership is so important. And then, of course, you asked earlier, cost is critical. It's critical not necessarily for the short term, but because ongoing cost savings are self-sustaining for companies and organizations, right? So if you generate X amount of savings each year, you can reinvest those savings into your business, which is so important, especially in lean years. That longer term view on your relationship and cost savings, looking at your objective to reduce the total cost of the value chain rather than just savings for your organization, are two important points.
Right. So Bob, correct me if I'm wrong. So I think what I hear you saying is it relates to the total cost of the value chain. Almost implied there is looking for win-wins for everybody involved. It's not just me. It's
Correct.
What can we do across the system?
Exactly. It's so important as we move forward, as we optimize our supply chains. It's so important to shift the paradigm in that direction. Absolutely.
Okay,
Hey,
great.
Bob,
Thanks.
the interesting thing is, a lot of times our clients will go out and beat up on their suppliers. You got to reduce my costs. I'm not competitive, things like that. And the questions they should ask, what can we do and the way we work with you so that we can help you reduce your cost and help us out? So for instance, instead of wanting deliveries 5 days a week, maybe we can consolidate down to 1 or 2 days. Therefore, you don't have the truck on the road and all that, but they never ask that question.
Exactly.
How can we help you, reduce your costs so you can help us?
There you go. Right. That's a great approach. Exactly. The other thing I wanted to mention was, you started the program by saying we just experienced a huge black swan event. And as you know, supply was constrained in many, many ways. And a lot of companies, a lot of great companies with great supply chain organizations were caught blind because they didn't understand the flows within their suppliers, right? So they really did no supply chain mapping. And that is something that I think has floated to the surface and become quite apparent over the past year, the need to not only save costs, but do it judiciously, right? And understand who your supplier is and what are the flows and what are the risks within those flows, right?
So supply chain mapping. So can you talk a little bit more what that looks like? What's an output of that?
Yeah, so clearly, I forget who it was talking about understanding capacity. It's not only important to understand your capacity and your capacity constraints, but what are the capacity constraints of your suppliers and your supplier's supplier? And where does the initial component, ingredient, raw material start, right? Is it in the oil and gas industry? Is it some other part of a value chain or other part of a supply network? And really understand their capabilities, what their capacity constraints are, if they can share, what that looks like. That's so important as we move forward and try to mitigate the risks and the major disruptions that we've seen over the past year.
Okay, that's a great idea.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Bruce.
One way to potentially, mitigate the issues is to have secondary, and in some cases, depending on what you're producing or buying, is having a tertiary or third vendor that could help meet issues if and when they arise. And one of the major issues at the moment is cost of shipping. If you're getting product from the Far East, containers used to be $2,500 to $3,000, and now they're almost 8 to 10 times that. And when you start adding, if you can get a container at all, that's another issue. But when you start looking at costs of the product, you have to, now that becomes a major factor. And in fact, I'm working with a project now where it's probably going to be cheaper to fly it in than it would be to put it on the ship. And plus, we might be able to get it. And if we said that something like that, before all this pandemic started, people would look at you like you're out of your mind. But that's something we have to now take into consideration is the cost of transportation, and especially if you're buying from the Orient, and assuming you can get the product, which is another issue.
Right. Okay. Good. Thank you, Bruce. So Ed, on the indirect side, you've often spoke about a path to excellence, key steps in the process when addressing indirect costs. In your mind, what are some of the success factors that really move the needle on cost reduction?
One of the most important things, Drew, is to analyze and validate your purchase history. So a lot of our clients, when they go out on their own to try to look at their costs, they're saying, why do I have to look at what happened? I was here last year. I know what's going on. And we have to do that because we don't know what's going on, and we have to analyze the spend. And you won't believe some of the things we find. So I'm going to give you some examples. We find different prices at different locations for the same product. For instance, uniforms. They got 3 or 4 locations. They're using the same uniform, but each one has a different price because somebody from each location negotiated a separate contract with the supplier. We also find that they're buying things that aren't on contract, not taking advantage of the best prices. They're using suppliers that they've never heard of. Why are people buying from these guys? We never heard of them. They're not under contract. They're not taking advantage of discounts. There's double payments. We found a manufacturer in Warminster that had 4 T1 lines. The IT department said we only need 2. They actually eliminated 2, but never told accountings to adjust the budgets. We come in and they've been paying for those 4 T1 lines for 3.5 years after they've been terminated. And luckily we were able to recoup like $70,000. So, that's one thing. And then you want to reevaluate the supplier relationships. As we mentioned before, the guy that with the relationship, you do not want him negotiating. And, you have to understand the industry and the supplier, the technology that's going on to get the best prices when you go out to renegotiate.
Okay. All right. So analyze, validate purchase history, understand suppliers in their industries, reevaluate current supplier relationships, all key. The one thing that we had a discussion around, which seemed like there was a lot of energy, was this whole notion of decide, implement, monitor. Why do I care about that?
Well, what happens is if you find savings, you need to implement as soon as possible. It's like a cash leak. The money is leaking out of the company. So you need to implement and get those savings working on your behalf.
Okay. So, and where does the monitor part come in, Ed? And why is that important?
Well, you ever hear the term they call the cash, what's it called? Geez, I talk about it all the time. The creep, the supplier creep. So what happens is if you're not monitoring your invoices, the suppliers will have a tendency to increase prices, and it's called the creep. So the prices go up. One of the things we provide in our service is we do an audit every month to make sure the prices tie back to the contract.
Okay.
The price creep. I got it. The price creep, Drew.
Yeah. So this whole thing around decide, implement, monitor, that kind of appeals to me because what it's talking about is execution. You and I've talked about this before, where the supplier agrees, but in the back of their mind, they're thinking, I'll just wait 3-6 months. And things will go back to to normal, and so this is all about blocking and tackling, I guess, is what you're saying in terms of we kind of get these things put into place, we decide, we implement, and then we just follow up to make sure that we're pursuing the steps that we agreed to. Very, very big, I think, in terms of long-term impact.
Well, the suppliers call it the customer inertia.
Okay.
They attempt to go out and negotiate, but then they get busy doing other things, and it's inertia. It never gets done. So the suppliers, they can procrastinate in getting back. They feel that, they'll never have to reduce the price.
Got it. Any comments or observations from anybody else in the group in terms of what Ed's just said? Or agree, disagree?
Just a quick comment. In the healthcare supply chain, it was just a common state of affairs that people that were buying medical components for surgical kits, for example, would go, they would win a bid, and they'd have to do that at a dramatically reduced price for a specific hospital. And then over the next 2 to 3 years, they would just keep ratcheting up the price, knowing they were going to get put out to bid again. And that just kept happening every 3-year cycle. That was the way it went. And if you just looked at the price of materials that the hospitals were buying, it was continually going up, regardless of the drop every 3 years. So it's one of those things you got to just keep on top of it and really have a good partnership with your suppliers so that we're all working together, not necessarily at odds with each other.
Great, Scott. Thanks. Ed, you've talked about the fact that you have done over 20,000 expense category reviews, and you've identified maybe a top 20 global expense categories where you see the greatest low-hanging fruit. Can you just share some examples, where you find the greatest opportunities for immediate cost reduction?
Yeah, so we look at 40 different expense areas, and overall, the savings average just under 20%. But we have some categories that are quite a bit higher, and the highest category of all of them is payroll processing. So anybody that's using an ADP or a Paychex, these big companies, what happens is they negotiate and they get a good price to start with, but every year in July, which is coming up, they increase prices 4 to 7%. So if anybody's been with these companies over 5 years, there's great opportunities for savings. There's also a couple areas where we find 30% savings. For instance, records management, pharmacy drugs, merchant card fees, and janitorial supplies. And the other category that's got some great savings is waste management, including regular waste and also medical waste are good opportunities.
Right. Okay. So again,
Drew, could I jump in there as a payroll guy? I'd have to agree. That's a great lead in, Ed. But not only do their costs jump up there, jumping on what Bruce said, and I think I've heard a couple times, is the partnership and the ability, the amount of time that's wasted with an ADP or some of these other national providers of trying to get service, of trying to get somebody there who understands what payroll is, what time and labor is, and what you as a client are trying to do. That's where I find the bigger savings. Forget about because payroll is relatively commoditized and inexpensive, but to be able to have the payroll processes or the time collection provide you the data that you need to manage your business, I think that's where the real savings can come about. And it becomes business intelligence and can make a big impact compared to some of the national guys that I compete against.
Right,
Yeah, Jerry, the other thing we see in payroll processing is a lot of times the clients will purchase the gold plan, which has 5 different modules.
Oh, yeah.
And the client's going to say, okay, we're going to do, we're going to implement this module. Next month, we're going to implement this module. So they've been spending, a lot of money for a long time for these 5 modules, and they've only implemented 2 of them. And things like that happen all the time.
All the time. Yeah, I would agree, Ed.
Got it. Okay. So Bruce, I'm a U.S. manufacturer. That same BDO study referenced earlier says that supply chain stability is the #1 factor that's most critical to the manufacturing recovery. And I think that's just kind of come out in spades here in recent months.
Right.
I'd like to explore that a little bit further. So you talk about vendors and how they can help reduce costs when considering product design, for my offering. What do you mean by that? Why do I care there?
Well, in a lot of cases, and an article I read recently, somebody was developing an injection molded piece, and beyond being functional, they were trying to make it beautiful. And their supplier said, "You don't need that. We can make it for actually." Was close to 80% less expensive because they were making it functional versus pretty, And it was an injection molded part, and not only included the piece price, but it also included the tooling. So working with your vendor on what you want to accomplish with a part you're designing or developing is because they know their business better than you know how their process works. That you could save lots of money up front, and once you build the tooling for X dollars, you're stuck, and then you own it, and regardless of you making it up the block or across the world, you need to be able to make a functional but least cost product. And once like I say, once you get the tooling done, it's all over. And I've actually worked on some projects where a local manufacturer was actually cheaper than the Orient, but regardless, it's just again, it's back to partnering. And working with your vendors as partners.
Yeah. So Bruce, and then I think probably a common thought, and I guess you touched on this already, is that if I think about outsourcing a component to you, you're just going to take that offshore, right?
No, not necessarily. I work with vendors from up the block to across the world, but not and a lot of vendors within the U.S. So I'm going to send if somebody comes to me with a product and gives me all the necessary documentation, I'm going to send it to local as well as across the world, and see who comes back with the best price and the best total cost. And the other issue about buying locally is lead time. Forgetting the pandemic and the fact that you may not be able to get the product on a container for a long period of time or whatever, is that locally you could set up delivery schedules of weekly or monthly, and you don't have inventory, and all that costs money. So you have to weigh the total cost of the product versus the piece price necessarily.
Right. So the myth is, that, get it cheaper offshore. I think we're seeing a dynamic change in the market here, in particular in the US. And then we've talked about this. I think Bob, touched on it earlier, is let's take a look at the whole value chain, right? And where we might be able to address some things to reduce costs to the benefit of all. Bruce, you've also talked about systematic ways to reduce costs. What do you mean by that?
Well, part of it is setting up, the process I mentioned before about partnering with vendors, and also setting up, on the delivery end, working with third-party logistics companies and other service providers that can help reduce the total cost, because you have to get it, the product costs what it costs, but to get it to the customer, you have to reduce the total cost within the supply chain. And so it becomes an end-to-end ongoing cost process that needs to be addressed.
Okay. So and I'm looking at some of the other stuff that we had talked about, 3PL, right? Third-party logistics as being one opportunity. You had talked earlier about these vendor summit meetings. What does it cost to bring people together? To kind of focus, on the product or the value chain or the offering or whatever. You never know, the opportunities that might result, out of that. We talked about end-to-end pricing, FOB pricing, large inventory buys, versus carrying costs, those kinds of things. And then the cash neutral position piece. What was that all about, Bruce?
Say that again.
Cash neutral positions.
Oh, yes. I worked with a company that sold a product to another company, and went to the company that was going to be the customer for my client, and said, "What do you need to pay for the product?" And they told me, and I set up a process where I got a delivered price, and set it up that it was, even though it was coming from the Orient, it was 30 days dating from receipt of goods, and set it up with the customer that they would pay 15 days after the receipt of goods. And over the first two deliveries, they were a little late in the 15 days, but over a couple of years and 2 million pieces of product being sold, they never took a penny out of my client never took a penny out of his pocket to pay the vendor. The only money he took out of his pocket was to pay me my commission for setting the thing up and monitoring the process. So you can do that, but you have to, have partners. Again, it goes back to work, understanding what the client might pay for a product, and then, working with your sources to get the price you want and at the delivery times you need.
Okay, so if I reflect, because I need to summarize this for myself, the big
Right.
idea relative to that piece, cash neutral position, is look, I just exert a little bit of brain power, on this, and essentially what's happening is they get the product before they have to pay. They've already received the cash, right? So it's an instant return. Before I have to pay my supplier, the
Right.
cash is already in the account, and it's those little things just like that that can make a huge difference. It's very
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And it works.
Yeah. We're just about at the end of our session here this afternoon. Any additional comments from anybody within the group? Okay.
Well, I'll just,
Go
go
ahead.
ahead. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to mention a third party, especially for companies that have labor intensive pick, pack, and shipping, is that third party logistics companies can be a major saving, as well as for a new company. You don't need infrastructure. You can set up through third party public warehousing. You don't need to hire a lot of people to pick, pack, and ship your product. And that, becomes a major cost saving.
Right. Bob, you're going to have a comment?
Yeah, just sort of a question for folks. Thoughts on extending payables? That's a trend. It's still a continuing trend for many companies, right? To improve cash flow, extending payables. I'm not advocating it. I'm asking perspectives. Anyone have a perspective?
Yeah, Bob, one of the things we're doing is we're doing just the opposite. We're trying to speed up payment and try to secure additional discounts. Because the ROI, on discounts is better than, waiting and paying later.
If I'm trying to manage working capital, I do want to extend payables, right? Or I want to cut, inventory. I want to extend payables, and then I want to collect on my receivables, and instead of 60 days out, do it in 30 days or less, right? But I think the point you're making there is it's a balancing act, and you don't necessarily want to tick people off. It's a tight wire, if you will.
Hey, Drew, sometimes if you can get a big enough discount, it's better to borrow the money at a low interest rate, pay off the accounts payable, take advantage of the discount.
Right. Okay. That's all blocking and tackling, isn't it? Right. I mean, that's what it is. Thinking about it from looking at it from all different elements of the prism to see what you can do to be more efficient, and effective. Okay, well, good discussion.
Beacon is the premier executive networking organization serving the Mid-Atlantic region. To learn more, go to beaconforlife.org.